Hey everyone, hope you had a good week as you were out shooting your 10 things for 7 days. I know it can be a really big challenge to keep up with that, so congratulations in advance on completing it. Hopefully over that span of time you found yourself improving a little bit in how you were choosing to take your pictures, what you were framing, and the kinds of considerations you were making to make really good photos. But I understand you can't do that all the time, and sometimes you're going to end up with photos that are just not that great. But that's kind of the second half that we want to understand about dealing with digital photography, is that even if we took a photo in camera that didn't turn out exactly how we wanted, there's a lot that we can do in post-production to be able to rescue or save certain images and bring them back to life. So I wanted to spend some time today just showing you some basics in Photoshop about how you can get started doing this. These are things that you can do even on your phone. Obviously, in your Photos app, you can edit any image and you can adjust the exposure and contrast and brightness and color and all of these things. But I'm going to show you with Photoshop because you just have a lot more freedom in what you can do. And so let's just go ahead and get into it. So as we can see here, I've got this photo that I took, and there's some good things about it. I think the framing is in pretty decent shape. I think it's an interesting subject. There's a good sense of depth and space and even some color buried in there. But the exposure was really difficult. We can see there's not a lot of clarity and color and brightness in the foreground and the middle ground, even though the sky is nice and blue and we can see some good definition in the clouds. So let's just go ahead and try to save this photo, see what we can do with it. There's lots of ways that we want to get started with this, but what we're going to be using is layer adjustments. And so if we can see here, if this is your first time in Photoshop, we have our image here in the center of the screen. We have a number of tools over on the left-hand side, and over on the right side you should hopefully see your layers panel. And this is going to show us everything that we have layered together. If we are bringing in multiple images, they'll show up here. But essentially it's pretty intuitive. Anything that is on top is the thing that will be the most visible or layered on top of other things and images and adjustments that come below it. So it might take a little bit of getting used to before you kind of know what you're doing, but once you get the hang of it, it's not too hard. So let's think about what's wrong with this picture in its own. As I mentioned, the sky looks really great. I was able to capture some nice blue in the sky. I was able to capture some definition in the clouds. But this statue here of this foo dog and the background, the trees, I guess the middle ground rather, they're very dark, underexposed we would say, right? I didn't let enough light into the camera on this one. And so we're losing a lot of definition. In real life, this dog is very blue, it's shiny, there's a lot of interesting texture. The middle ground, the trees, it was autumn when I took this photo, so there's some nice like oranges and reds and yellows. But those didn't show up in my pictures. So let's just see if we can't bring them back. The first thing we want to do is just kind of play around a little bit and see what a proper exposure for this thing might be. So if I go over to my layers panel, you'll see at the very bottom there's a number of little icons and buttons. If you can see my little mouse there, we're going to click this one that looks like a circle. Half is filled in with white and half is left empty with black. When we open this, these are our layer adjustments, and we can add something in effect to our layer that's easily adjustable after the fact, and we can keep manipulating it as we need. But as I mentioned, the exposure is the real problem here. So let's go and click the one for exposure, and we can see above my layer we've got a new exposure 1 layer. Now up above that in the properties, we should be able to see some parameters that we can adjust. So let's just start by dragging the exposure up. And that seems to be working okay. Let's drag it up so that we can get more definition in that foo dog statue. That's maybe a little too much there, we see. Things are starting to get a little blown out, high contrast. So let's just find a nice middle ground here, and that looks pretty good to me. So that brought my statue of the dogs into focus. It brought my trees in the middle ground into, a nice, more saturated color, more clarity. We can see more of these statues as they recede down this path. But the problem is we've lost our sky now, right? Because we adjusted the exposure for the entire photo. We don't see that nice blue sky. But the good news is all of our layer adjustments work with things that we call masks. And as we can see here, if we click on the little icon of the layer adjustment here for the exposure layer, that brings up our properties and parameters. But if I click on the little white box that's next to it that has the little chain icon, we can see that this is our layer mask. And a layer mask essentially works in a way that uses values of black and white to tell the computer what amounts of this and where do we want to let effects through. So if you can imagine it this way, white is basically transparent. If we have a fully white layer mask, that means all of the effects of the exposure are going to go through to all of the parts of the image. But if I go over to my tools panel and I pick a brush tool, paintbrush tool, we can see it right here, and I have my color set to black for the foreground, we can start painting in places where that effect will be blocked on our layer mask. You should be able to see over here in that icon that we're starting to see some black show up. It's not just a pure white image in that rectangle. We're seeing the areas preview for us where we're painting black to block out areas of that mask. So this is actually our mask, right? We're masking out things that we don't want to be affected by that exposure adjustment. So I'm doing this with a very big brush here. We can see up in my brush settings, I have it set to 0 hardness, which gives me a nice kind of soft edge. But we can also change our brush size. As we can see, I need to get into some more detail here, areas that my big brush is going to not give me a really nice kind of crisp kind of edge around these things. So if you press the bracket keys, which are kind of look like the parentheses, but they're right next to the P key on your keyboard probably, and they look square, right? So the square bracket to the left is to bring your brush size down, and the square bracket to the right is a shortcut to bring your brush size up. So just knowing these kind of shortcuts, you'll learn them as you go in Photoshop, but this is a really quick and easy one to make sure that I work really quickly. And now we can see I can paint in much closer to the foo dog's face. I can get kind of those nice sharp edges, bring in a little bit more detail around the bottom of the trees. We want to make sure we get this side here, and that's going to help me start to get a little bit more control over my layer mask. Let's bring this up now. Another thing I can do is set the opacity down a little bit, and that means that the brush is only going to work in certain layers of transparency. So it might not be fully black. If we were to zoom into this layer mask here that I'm working with, we'd see that we're starting to see grays introduced. So you can work with layer masks both in just kind of very stark black and white terms, but if you start to work in grayscale, you can also get some more different effects out of this. So let's go ahead. I think I'm about ready here. There might be just a few things I want, little streaks I got with my tiny brush, but that already looks a lot better, right? We can click this off by clicking the eyeball icon, and that is, what we started with. And here's what we've got now. It's a radically different photo, right? Much, much better. But there might still be some things that I want to do. So let's go ahead, and I know that maybe on this foo dog here statue in the foreground, I still want to bring its exposure up a little bit more. Maybe see if I can't get a little bit more clarity in the textures and balance in the whites and blacks. So what I'm going to do is just use a selection tool to only select the foo dog as it's sitting on our pedestal. So we can find this again over in the Tools panel. If you look, usually it's about 4 icons down, and you can hover over and it'll tell you. This is our quick selection tool, and this is a really easy one. If you click and hold, you'll see there are other ones, object selection tools, magic wand tools. But this one, the little paintbrush that looks like it's got a dotted line circle around it, is a really good one to get you started in selecting things out in Photoshop. So I'm going to click that bracket key again just to bring my brush size up. And as I start to paint over the foo dog, the software recognizes where the edges are pretty well. Now, it's not perfect. There will be things that we need to add and subtract. So if I zoom in, and you can always zoom in Photoshop by pressing Command or that little curly Q looking thing by your space bar and the plus sign will zoom in. If I press Command and the minus sign up in your number line, that'll let us zoom out. So let's zoom in. Let's see what we've got here. It looks like we have some edges that I didn't miss. So let's go ahead, that I didn't grab. So let's go ahead, bring my brush size down. We'll get those nice edges all the way out to where that statue kind of ends. Another thing I might do is see here, I didn't get the side of our pedestal, so we want to make sure we get that too. And this can be kind of hard to tell as you're doing this. You know, seeing the definition of that squiggly, kind of shining, glistening line that tells us where our selection is might not always be the easiest thing to see, based on, you know, the characteristics of your picture. But there's another really quick kind of trick you can use just to see what you've selected. And if I zoom out, and you can see how this is done, you just press the Q key, just the letter Q, and that gives us a preview of our selection. Everything that's not been selected will kind of be shaded out in red, and everything that has been selected will remain the color and the, you know, the values that it was in the normal picture. We can always disable this just by pressing Q again. So there we go. Looked like I had a pretty good selection. There was one thing that I noticed. If I press Q again, we can see I've grabbed a little bit of this tree. I've grabbed some over here, it looks like. You know, so there's some cleaning up that I need to do. And what I need to do, now instead we can see, I don't know, if I zoom in on my brush, it doesn't show us, but there's a little plus sign in the middle of our selection brush, quick selection tool brush kind of circle there. If I press the Option key, and I'm on a Mac, this might be different, it might be Control if you're on a PC, but if I press the Option key, you might be able to see that it turns to a minus. What this does is it allows us to subtract things from our selection. So now you can see I'm moving the boundaries of my selection in by painting out that tree that we had. I'm painting out this little dot that we can see on the screen. And there, I mean, this might be pretty good for now. There's a little bit I missed there, so let's just use the plus normal default to add that in, add a little bit here. And this is going to give me a nice crisp kind of selection of this foo dog. So once again, let's zoom out, press Q. Looks really good. Looks like a good kind of selection around that object. The neat thing about this is, once I have this object selected, I can go and make another layer adjustment. This time let's do another exposure, but this will just affect the foo dog that we had selected. If you look at the layer mask preview that it gives us down in the layers panel, we can see the white is very crisply defined as, the shape of the foo dog, and the rest is sort of, is all black. It's not letting it through. I accidentally rotated my screen. So let's go see if we can't find my rotate tool. It's R, or you can find it here in the tools panel. If I double click, hopefully it should go back to normal, or I can just kind of drag and lock it back in. These are little things you'll find. You might make a little slip up like that in Photoshop, but typically it's not too hard to learn kind of the shortcuts and the keys to get back to where you want it. Okay, so anyway, here's my layer mask. We've got just the foo dog letting the effect through. Everything else in the background is blacked out, so it won't let the effect through. And let's just bring the exposure up just on him. That's pretty good. Gives us a big difference, right, between what it was at 0 versus about 1, I think. I don't know if I want to go any past that, because it just will start to look a little bit too blown out, a little grainy. So it's about finding balance. But this has already helped me bring out a lot of definition in like the crazy textures and colors and the dripping kind of glaze patterns on this ceramic statue. And that's starting to look pretty good. One thing I might want to do now is to heighten this effect. We can see we've got a blue figure against a blue background, but we have these nice complementary colors. If you know anything about complementary colors, our complementary to blue is orange. And by adding contrast between those two things, we can create a lot more emphasis and pop in the things that we wanted to draw the eye to in a picture. So maybe what we want to do is actually play with some color adjustment and make this more orange, make it kind of a more warm tone. And we can do this really simply. Let's say we know we want to do this to everything other than the dog we just selected. So instead of having to go back into this quick selection tool and paint the dog back in again, we can just copy our mask. So, or actually we'll translate it to a selection instead of copying it. So if you go and you make sure that you're clicking on the mask icon, not the adjustment icon, but the mask icon down here in the preview for the layers panel, right click, and find the option that says Add Mask to Selection. So clicking that, we can see it's brought back our selection around the foo dog statue here. What we want to do now, because we want to select everything that is the opposite or the inverse of that dog, what we can do is go ahead and go up to Select up at the top menu bar, and we want to select the inverse. So let's find it. There's inverse. And we can select, and as we can see here, it drew a kind of tracing line border around the whole image. We're still selected around the foo dog, but what it's telling us is that everything around that foo dog is the selected space and he is not. So if we press Q, we can see again the opposite is true. Our dog is now redded out, that because that's not included in the selection, and the background is everything that is still available. So let's press Q again to exit that. And what we want to do now, because we have our selection, let's just add another layer adjustment. Let's go and see what we can do. So first thing I might want to try is hue and saturation. These are kind of our color effects down here in this second or third set rather of layer adjustments. So let's go with hue and saturation. We can see we've got our options that have popped up here in the properties panel, and we can start by playing around. So here all of our values are set to 0, but if I pull this to the right or the left, we can see we get some really strange effects, but I don't want to really affect the hue. Everything looked good in color to me, like it was in the right area, that I don't want to color adjust, but I really just want to boost those colors. So saturation will let me do that. Our colors become more saturated. So as we can see here, I slide my slider up, and that's a little too saturated. I just want it to look subtly a little bit more warm, a little bit more colorful, to kind of work in contrast with all the blues that I'm seeing. Again, lightness will do some other things too. You can make your picture lighter or darker, which is different from exposure. I usually don't mess with that. If I feel like I've got a good exposure and things are looking balanced, then I'm usually pretty happy to go with that. Okay, well that looks a lot better already. Maybe I just still want to step up that effect a bit. If I go to color balance and we add another, I needed to do the same thing. So let's rewind just a touch. I need to copy this one again. We're going to add our mask to the selection. Because we've got it selected, now we can just auto-generate a color balance effect layer that will allow us to affect the presence of different colors. So if I want less blue in my picture on the parts where we have left unmasked, we can slide more to the yellow. We can see that that creates a much more yellow tone. If I want less green, I might slide it to magenta. But as you can see here, if you go too hard with these, if you go a little too much with the effect, it's going to start looking a little unrealistic. But in this case, let's set all of our values back to 0. And I know I just kind of want to bring in some yellows and some oranges. So we'll just drag a little bit to the yellow side, drag a little bit to the red side. And let's go ahead if we can see any difference that made. If you go over to your icon of the eye over in the layers panel again, you can always click these on and off to see the difference. So let's click that off. Barely visible, but a little bit warmer, right? This is off, this is on, off, on. Again, subtlety I think is really important here. So really good job. We can click off all of our effects and we can see we've gone from here to here. With just a few clicks of the button, with a little bit of know-how about how to get around Photoshop and working with these layer adjustments in the panels. So let's just try and save another photo. Every photo is going to be different. You're going to need to do different things in order to create different effects and achieve what you want to achieve. So a little bit of flexibility and understanding of what's available in Photoshop, I think will help you come up with good results for your specific photos. So here we go. Another really bad photo, right? There's big problems with this. There's a really overcast, washed out gray sky. The colors are really muted and not very fun to look at. The framing is okay, but maybe might be able to be adjusted. So let's just try to address these things. Let's start by just thinking, well, what happens if we take the color away completely? So we can just try that. If we go to our layer adjustments panel and we click black and white, we can see here it has already taken it and put it into grayscale. In our properties up at top, we can see we can adjust the amount and the contrast and kind of the levels of different things, right? Of our yellow channel, of our green channel, of the cyan channel, of the blue channel. And so you can play around with some of these effects, you know, just till you find something that you like. Or we can maybe try something a little bit funkier with this picture. I think maybe working with this, putting it into black and white, saving some color in a really important selective area, and then also dealing with contrast and brightness will help us save this. So let's say I want to get rid of this layer. If I have it selected in the layers panel down here in the bottom right, all I have to do is click the trash can. It'll ask you if we want to delete it, and yes, I do. So now we're back to normal. What I want to do now, I'm going to zoom in. I think I really like the red, you know, as an accent color in this photograph. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep this the same. There's another way that we can make a selection in Photoshop that's not over here, the quick selection tool, and that is to use the pen tool. So the pen tool can be found down here. You can always hit the letter P just to access it if it's you're kind of accustomed to shortcuts. But I've got it now, and what the pen tool allows us to do is to draw out very specific paths. We can do this in a number of ways. We can just click a point. We can see it's given me a blue point on the screen. And I'm going to click to the other corner here of our Monticello Grain Company sign to create a line. And as I keep clicking, I'm going to keep creating a shape that goes all the way around this part here where I want to save the color. And if I get to the point where I'm ready to close my shape, close the path, if I hover over the first point, we can see it gives a little circle icon next to the pen. That means close path. So let's go ahead and do that. Now we can see we've got a path that is selected around Monticello Grain Company on our grain elevator here, but it's not shimmering, right, like the selection is. So what we need to do is actually make this a selection. So with the pen tool selected, if you right click, or I think if you option click for most people, you'll see that we get some options here. So what we want to do is make selection, right? This is going to be the selection. So let's go ahead and do this. Let's just set this. Feather radius means how soft your edge will be. If you want a really hard one, a hard edge on your selection, you set it to 0. If you want kind of a more diffused, more feathery, soft one, you can set it to any number of pixels that you want. But let's just go ahead and leave it at 0. Okay, so we've got our selection. We see it. The line is kind of shimmering. We're good to go. But because, as I mentioned, we want to keep this, but we want to affect everything else. We want to turn everything else around it black and white. We're going to do that same trick where we go to select up at the top menu and inverse. That means we're going to keep everything inside our initial selection the same, but we're going to be affecting everything out around it. So let's do that. Let's go and get our black and white layer adjustment again. As we can see here, the mask is showing us in the preview what has been masked, what hasn't been. And we can start playing around with some color balance here. And this is really up to you. You might find certain things. I think I found on the blue channel here, if I took that down, I got a little bit kind of a grayer sky, so I wanted to bring it up. I wanted to maybe bring in some more contrast in these windows and some of the darks, so it'll just take some playing around. For now, I think yellows I wanted to bring up because those are nice like highlights. But let's just say that this is good, right? Looks great to me. Already a much better picture. We click this off. This kind of ugly, boring colors, they're not very interesting. By taking them away, we can start to draw attention to the color that we liked, which was this kind of very rough textured red, very muted, desaturated. So let's do the same thing. Let's try and bring the saturation in this area up a little bit. See if we can't get that red color to pop a little bit more. So we'll do the same thing. If I right click on my mask icon down here, my mask preview, we're going to add mask to selection, and that'll bring up what we just did. Again, we want to, though, inverse it back so that we get just the Monticello grain sign. So again, you can always select the inverse of something by going up to select and inverse right here. So let's go ahead and let's just add a hue and saturation layer adjustment to this. So we can see here, now everything else is blacked out in the image preview at the lower right. and just the Monticello grain part of the elevator is letting the effect through. And we can see this in effect. If I bring up my saturation, it can get very blown out and strange, but we just want maybe a few ticks of a little bit more interesting color just to kind of select that out. It's looking a little bit more purple to me, so I might actually adjust some of my color balance on this one too to give it a more kind of rusted red feel. And then also I can play with color and brightness, or lightness rather, by playing with this slider. But you know, that looks okay. You know, already a lot better. Let's go ahead. We can see our effects without and then with. Looking much better. One final thing I might want to do is to add to the whole image a little bit more control over the brightness and contrast. So when we talk about contrast, what we're talking about typically is the balance between black and white, light and dark. You know, you can see photos that have a very low amount of contrast that give us kind of a faded, maybe like nostalgic sort of feel. High contrast images tend to look a lot more bold and grainy and things like this. And I think this is a good, bold, grainy, high contrast image. So let's go ahead. For the whole image, we see we are not masking out anything that, you know, for the effect. If we bring the contrast up, we can see that the darks get darker, the lights get lighter, and it's looking pretty good. If I bring up the brightness, you know, the sky maybe is a little too like kind of gray for me. If I bring up the brightness, the overall image brightness will kind of pop back into place. So that's looking a lot better. Again, looks like maybe now I'm noticing the red of my grain signs a little too saturated. So I can always change that by going back to the hue and saturation layer above our original image and bringing that saturation back down. So it reacts in real time. You can always step off these effects after the case. Okay, that looks really good. One last thing I might want to do is play around a little bit with cropping. You know, this is a pretty well cropped photo, I think, but we can always change basically the dimensions of our photo and what is included and what's not included by clicking C on your keyboard or finding the crop tool over here on the left. So once we click this, we can see we get the bars that we can drag around, we can reframe, we can resize. Let's say actually, you know, I like this. Maybe I want a little bit more sky. Actually, I could put in more sky, but that's a little more complicated at this point. But yeah, I could always crop this down a little bit. I can move the image around so that it's placed differently if I want more emphasis on the left side than the right side. That looks pretty good. So there we go. There's our image now. It's a much different image after a little bit of cropping, a little bit of black and white, a little selective color, and some brightness and contrast. We can go from something like this to something like this. Much more proud of this photo. Let's do just a couple more really quick ones to show you a couple different tricks. Here's another photo that I've got that looks okay. I think the colors are decent. It was a gray overcast day. I think I shot this the same day as the last photo. But it's a photo of some buffalo. And this is just more of like a know how to do it sort of demonstration. You know, I like the balance between these two buffalo, but let's pretend you've got something in your photo that you want to subtract, that you wish wasn't in the picture when you were starting or when you shot it, that you wish you could subtract. Well, you know, just get rid of entirely. So we can do this really easily. Let's zoom in again with Command and plus, and let's say I like this buffalo, the big one in the foreground, but I don't like this guy who's just kind of this amorphous blob facing away from us. Doesn't have a lot of character, throws off kind of the balance I was going for on this photo. We can just go ahead and get rid of this guy. So there's a couple ways that we can do this. We want to get rid of things in our photo to help kind of make them just look better. But we can go back to that quick selection tool by finding it in the tools gallery over here, or just press W on your keyboard. And let's just select that buffalo here. And I'm going to zoom in. I'm going to bring my brush very, very fine amount down. And I'm going to actually select around him a little bit. We want to get a little bit of the kind of area around the buffalo and not just the buffalo itself. So in the case where I was doing the foo dog statue in the first example, I wanted a really crisp selection. I wanted the edges to be very tightly contained to just what I wanted to select. But if we want to get rid of something and just kind of subtract it, it's okay to paint around it just a touch. So let's get a little bit more here on this buffalo's back. a little bit less by clicking Option to use the subtract selection. Okay, we can always look and see here. Looks okay, pretty decent cutout, doesn't need to be exact. One thing I might do now, though, is I can affect the hardness of that selection edge. So if I go to Select again, and I go down to Modify, I'm going to feather this selection. So instead of having a hard line for the selection, I'm going to have kind of a softer one. And 5 pixels sounds great. You know, we're just kind of playing around here. Here's where the fun stuff comes in. So I've got my object selected that I want to get rid of. If I right-click, I should be able to find the option that says Fill. Let's go ahead and click Fill. Now there's a few options you can pick for this. It's automatically set to color. If I was to use Fill Color, and it would fill it with the white that I have kind of in my foreground color here over in the left side at the bottom of our Tools panel. But there's other options. We can go with the foreground color, background color, we can pick our own color, but we're going to pick Content Aware. This lets the computer basically do the work for us. So let's click OK. And there we go. Our buffalo is pretty much gone, right? At a distance, you can hardly tell that he was there. What the computer did was kind of figured out, you know, what should be around in the background, what should be behind that object, and has kind of automatically filled it in. But we can see there's still kind of some ghostly image of the buffalo left. If we want to get rid of that, let's go ahead and we'll pick a new tool. What we're going to use now is the Clone Stamp tool. You can get this in the Tools panel. It looks like a little stamp, or you can just click S. So let's go ahead and get that one. This one's a little more complicated to use. So the way this works is if you press Option, you'll see it comes up with a little crosshairs. This is going to be your sample area. That means that's the sample that you're picking here, and whatever you click on once you have Option held will be what you paint in once we release. So I can hopefully demonstrate this for you. If I click, you know, around here, you can see there's a little bit of a line. I'm going to sample right in that section, and as I move over, you can see it gives you kind of this ghostly preview of what you'd sampled. And as you start painting in, you can see it starts to basically take everything from over here and move it over where I'm painting. So we can do multiple samples, and sometimes this takes some practice to kind of get used to, you know, sampling over here, giving it just a couple clicks around just to kind of hide it. This is really good for you know, background stuff where there's not a lot of detail. You can be a little bit more kind of artistic or painterly. It doesn't need to look exactly you know, convincing. You know, that the human eye is never going to notice that there was something painted out here if we do this well. And again, like, I also sometimes like to set my opacity down because it just gives us less of that effect. It gives us a little bit more subtlety in the edges, in the layering of these things. And now if I zoom out, I think most of us, you know, if we're lucky, could hardly tell that buffalo was ever there in the first place. So that's just a little bit too, again, about how we can use the Clone Stamp tool and the autofill in order to, the auto content aware fill in order to be able to subtract things. There's another really quick and easy way we can do this that is a lot of fun, and actually I find this kind of a Zen activity, which is appropriate for this photo, right? So I have this statue, I believe it's like a Buddhist icon of some sorts, but I have ladybugs all over it, Japanese beetles, ladybugs. And we want to get rid of them. Let's pretend, I actually think that they make for an interesting part of the picture, but once again, let's pretend like we want to get rid of these. And perhaps the easiest way to do that is to find the tool over here that looks like the Band-Aid, and this is the Spot Healing Brush tool. You can see a little demo of what it will do in this preview that pops up, but basically we can just really easily paint away anything that we want to get rid of, and it works a lot like the content-aware autofill. So there goes that bug, there goes that one, there goes this one, all with kind of just a click of a button. Really, really easy to get rid of. You know, things, oh, I cast a shadow there, the bug was, so let's get rid of that as well. But you see, this makes it really, really easy to get rid of, you know, certain blemishes. You can imagine this is really good if you struggle from acne, you know, or your subject is, you can always get rid of them. It's really good for fixing blemishes and things like that. There's a number of different ones. There's a healing brush tool, content aware move tool. These are all things that are typically used just to kind of heal our images, to take certain things away, subtract them, smooth them out, make them look a little bit more aesthetic. So there we go. Just a few tricks. Obviously, Photoshop is a super comprehensive software. It allows you to do just infinite amounts of things to your image to make them better. But just using these that I have kind of demonstrated today, using layer adjustments, understanding how to crop and use selective color, how to erase and subtract things from your images, are going to give you a big head start. So that's going to be part of your project for this week, is that you will go back into your 7 things, or 10 things for 7 days project that you completed last week, and you're going to find some of your photos that maybe didn't turn out so great that you think you want to rescue. So I have more information about this below, as well as some other helpful things that might be useful for you this week. So get started, find your worst photos, and see what you can do to rescue them. And I look forward to seeing what you've got done. Let me know if you have any questions, and enjoy.